Okay, picture this. You're looking at someone you know, a friend, a family member, but their face starts to twist. It warps into something monstrous. I mean, it sounds like a nightmare, right? But for some people, this is their everyday reality. It's caused by an incredibly rare neurological condition, and that's what we're digging into today. We're looking at a clinical case study of something called Prosopometamorphopsia. It's a real mouthful, I know, but it basically hijacks the way we see the human face.
And that quote you're seeing, that's not from a horror movie. Nope, that's a direct quote from a 58-year-old man explaining what faces look like to him. He actually told researchers at Dartmouth that every single face he saw in person looked, and this is his word, demonic. So yeah, let's get into this case study.
All right, so here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to break it down into 5 key parts. First, we'll look at the patient's actual case. Then, we'll get into the super clever method they use to see what he sees. After that, we'll dive into the brain science, figure out what this isn't, and finally talk about what it's like to live with this and where the research is headed. Okay, first up, a case of demon faces. Let's meet the patient whose unique case really opened the door for all this new research. So here's the rundown on our patient. Let's call him VS. He's 58, and for about 31 months, he'd been seeing these demonic faces. But here's the absolute kicker, the detail that changes everything. It only happened with in-person faces. When you looked at a face on a screen or in a photograph, it looked perfectly normal. No distortion at all. This one specific detail was the key that unlocked this whole study. You'll also see his neuropsych scores were perfect, but he did have a history of a head injury and a small lesion on his left hippocampus.
The official name for this is Prosopometamorphopsia, or PMO for short. Let's just quickly break that down. Prosopon, that's Greek for face, and metamorphopsia, that means perceptual distortion, so face distortion. And what's really, really important to get here is that this is a problem with the visual system. It's a processing glitch in the brain. It's not a psychiatric issue. The person's eyes are working fine. The light hitting them is normal. It's the brain's final rendering that gets all warped.
All right, on to section 2. Visualizing the invisible. This is where things get really cool. I mean, how do you actually see what someone else is seeing, especially when what they're seeing is a distortion? It's been a huge challenge for decades, but these researchers found a way. So here's the problem researchers always ran into. It was like a catch-22. They'd ask a patient to describe the distortion, right? They'd create an image based on that description. But when they show the new distorted image back to the patient to ask, hey, is this it? Well, the patient's brain would distort that image too. You can never get a straight answer. It was a loop you couldn't get out of. But remember that key detail about our patient, VS? He saw screens totally fine. That was the breakthrough. So the researchers came up with this brilliant, almost simple method. They had the patient look at a real person in the room and see the distortion. At the same time, he'd look at a normal photo of that same person on a computer screen. Then, and this is the genius part, he'd give them live feedback while they used photo editing software on the picture. They'd tweak and warp the digital photo in real time until he said, stop. That's it. That's exactly what I see in real life. And as the lead author, Antonio Mello, says here, this was a huge deal. For the very first time, they were able to create a photorealistic image of what a PMO patient actually sees and have the patient confirm it. Think about that. This isn't just some cool science experiment. It's a massive step forward for diagnosis. And maybe just as important, it's a way to validate what these patients are going through. For so long, people just didn't believe them.
Okay, let's move into the neuroscience behind this. Section 3, mapping a distorted brain. What does a condition this rare actually tell us about how our brains handle the incredibly complex job of processing faces?
Well, a lot of clues actually come from patients who have something called hemi-PMO. That's where only half of a face looks distorted. And what we learn from this is fascinating. If there's damage to the brain's left hemisphere, it usually messes up the right side of the face they're looking at. But if the right hemisphere is damaged, which is the side that does more of the heavy lifting for face processing, it can mess up the left side, the right side, or the whole thing. It's pretty clear evidence that our brain processes the two halves of a face almost independently before stitching them together into one complete picture.
Now, this is a super important clinical point. The problem isn't just in their field of vision, like a blind spot. The distortion is locked onto the face itself. It's something called an object-centered reference frame. Let me make that simple. If a patient sees a person's left eye as drooping, that eye will still look like it's drooping even if the person tilts their head sideways or even upside down. The glitch is attached to the brain's very idea of a left eye on a face. This tells us the error is happening way up the chain at a really high level of cognitive processing.
All right, time for section 4. And this is a big one in any clinical setting, the differential diagnosis. Basically, we need to be really clear about what this is by being clear about what it isn't. It gets confused with other conditions all the time.
Yeah, the number one mix-up is with prosopagnosia, which you might know as face blindness. The difference is absolutely critical. With PMO, it's a perception problem. The face looks warped and wrong, but you can usually still tell who the person is. With face blindness, it's a recognition problem. The face looks perfectly normal, but you've no idea who you're looking at. Remember our patient, VS? He knew he was looking at his wife or his friends. They just looked demonic.
So where does this fit in the grand scheme of things? Well, first off, and this is important, it's a distortion of something that's actually there. It's not a hallucination. It's not seeing things that don't exist. It's a specific kind of what's called metamorphopsia. And that falls under the really interesting umbrella of Alice in Wonderland syndrome, which is a whole category of disorders where your perception of size and shape gets all out of whack. And that brings us to our final section. Let's step away from the pure neuroscience for a minute and talk about the human side of this. What's it actually like to live in a world where faces are warped? And is there any hope on the horizon? This quote from Brad Duchesne, the senior author on the study, honestly, it's pretty chilling. It gets right to the heart of the real-world damage a misdiagnosis can do. I mean, just imagine, you're describing a real visual problem, but because it sounds so strange, so unbelievable, you get diagnosed with schizophrenia and put on antipsychotics. This is why getting the word out both to the public and to clinicians is so incredibly important. This is a visual processing disorder, period. But here's a look at the brain's absolutely incredible ability to adapt. You'd think living with this would be a constant state of terror, and I'm sure it is at first. But what the reports show is that many patients, including VS, eventually, well, they get used to it. They habituate. The brain sort of recalibrates, and this warped reality just becomes their new normal. It's still strange, but it becomes manageable. And this is a really hopeful sign. The researchers decided to try something simple. They had the patient look through colored filters. And the results, as you can see on this chart, are just wild. When he looked through green or cyan filters, the distortions got way better. But when he looked through red or pink ones, they actually got worse. Nobody really expected that. It suggests there's this really deep connection between the parts of our brain that process color and the parts that process shape. And more importantly, it points to a really promising, simple, non-invasive way to maybe treat this. So let's just end on this thought. Cases like this show us that the brain's face processing system is an absolute marvel. But it's also a powerful reminder that what we experience as reality isn't like a video camera just recording the world. It's an active construction. It's an interpretation. And sometimes that interpretation can be incredibly fragile. It really makes you wonder, right? What other part of your reality, something you take for granted every single day,